We have breaking news from the Toronto Maple Leafs. Brad Treliving is set to become the team's new GM. We'll discuss his record in Calgary and how things could be moving forward with him and the team coming up next. So welcome back to another video here, Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we have some significant breaking news from the Toronto Maple Leafs organization. We have confirmation from enough NHL reporters and informed sources to say that Brad Treliving will indeed become the new general manager of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, there was breaking news, I guess you could say breaking news, or somewhat. Last night, Darren Dreger put out a post on Twitter. He was the first to have it to say that Treliving was going to be hired, but they still had to work out the terms of the contract. So I didn't want to report on anything until the contract was in place, because clearly they might have a mutual agreement to want to work together, but if they can't work out a contract, things can always go sideways. And as some of the reporters say, until it's done, it's not done, and it can always, work out different than you might have thought. So at this point, Elliotte Friedman's reported that the contract was all finalized this morning. Treliving is on his way to Toronto now. Likely going to be a press conference soon, unless they want to do it this evening, which is not common. I would suspect that the press conference will most likely be sometime tomorrow morning. But at this point, Treliving has accepted the position and has worked out a contract according to NHL sources. We've had reports from Darren Dreger, Kevin Weeks, Elliotte Friedman, Frank Saravalli, all over it. So that's enough for me to say this is a done deal, and Treliving is indeed the next GM to replace Kyle Dubas with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, Treliving was a name that stuck out to most right from the get-go as soon as we knew Kyle Dubas was not going to be returning to his post in Toronto. Of course, Treliving himself, not that long ago, walked away from his post with the Calgary Flames. Just a reminder there too, he was not fired by the Flames. His contract was up, expired. We knew that. Treliving was on an expiring contract last year. He had opted to not sign an extension because there was one offered. He decided to wait. And then at the end of the season, the Flames still wanted him back. He chose not to renew and to move on. Never really spoke publicly, so we don't know all the reasons. But it's many believe said that he didn't want to work with Daryl Sutter anymore, and that Sutter was still going to be there as coach and just wanted to change for a start. Well, Sutter ended up moving on later anyways. The Flames later did fire him, but that's another story, which I wonder how he felt about that afterwards. But sometimes change is necessary. Treliving was in Calgary for 9 years. Now, to take a look at things with Kyle Dubas, they moved on from a guy who was there in the GM role, for obviously a shorter span than Treliving was in Calgary. We know that the Dubas had no issues making the playoffs. They were a perennial playoff team. They only had one series win, which came this year, and obviously lost out early in the second round in a 5-game series to the Florida Panthers. So clearly that kind of didn't necessarily make all the decisions here. We know that because it sounded like Dubas was offered an extension, and obviously things broke down afterwards. So I don't know that the record in the playoffs really was a driving force here. I have to say it probably was not. But Treliving in 9 years was in the playoffs 5 times with the Calgary Flames and had 2 series wins. I know I see a lot of fans saying this is not an upgrade over Kyle Dubas, so that they feel already they're kind of being hard on the decision here and kind of making it sound like the Leafs have made a bad move. But, at the end of the day, things couldn't be worked out between Dubas and Shanahan, and maybe Dubas was the better GM here. We'll never really know the answer to that since things didn't get worked out, and Dubas is not with the Maple Leafs here any longer. But, based on, the recency bias, which is what a lot of people get judged on with Treliving, you can look at last offseason. He was one of the most talked about GMs, one of the busiest guys, faced with a predicament here. He ended up losing Johnny Gaudreau to free agency, so the franchise is arguably the franchise's greatest player, one of them for sure, walked with nothing in return out of Calgary last offseason. At the 11th hour, they thought Johnny was going to re-sign. He did not and walked away, stunning the Flames. I'm not really sure how the conversations went or how everything went, but of course he lost Johnny Gaudreau in free agency, so that was a big L for the Flames and the management. And then, of course, shortly after that, they found out that Matthew Tkachuk would not re-sign and was basically forcing a trade out of the organization. So they ended up doing this huge blockbuster trade, a sign-and trade at that, the first of its kind in recent NHL history, and arguably the biggest blockbuster deal in a long time, sending Matthew Tkachuk to Florida for Jonathan Huberdeau and Mackenzie Weegar. Now, a lot of people are looking at the Florida Panthers and Matthew Tkachuk in the Stanley Cup final right now and saying, oh yeah, they lost that deal. That was horrible. But you know what? You got to remember, he was forced into that. He was at a situation where his young star player wanted out. To get Huberdeau and Uyghur back based on their previous histories was phenomenal. I'd love the trade in the beginning. I mean, I obviously would say long-term Florida wins the trade because Tkachuk's younger and just, I think, that more dynamic player that can drive you to success more than these other guys. Not that they're not good players and they can be a part of it, but, you know, obviously to get a player like Tkachuk's magnitude was a win for Florida. But I thought, for example, we'd see Florida take a step back and then take a step forward, which kind of happened, just not the way I envisioned it. You know, Huberdeau and Uyghur, did they have the great years in Calgary? No, but it can be a big adjustment, you know, with new teammates in a new city. And it didn't help that Daryl Sutter was there as well. Now, the Matthew Tkachuk situation, though, I might argue could have been avoided because, and we don't know 100%, but in the rumor mill, it was suggested that Matthew Tkachuk, when he signed his bridge deal after his ELC had expired, that he wanted an 8-year deal, but the Flames, because of the way they had managed their cap, could not do it. So they had to get him into a bridge deal. When that bridge deal expired, he wanted out, had to be traded. Well, if they could have got him an 8-year deal in the beginning, that wouldn't have been the case. That wouldn't have happened, you know. So a whole different scenario. Of course, he also signed Nazem Kadri to a 7-year, $7 million per year contract last year. So he was one of the busiest guys, like making all the headlines last year. So we know that Brad Treliving, of course, like I said, because of all of that, I think that played a big role in him getting this job. For one, he was a longtime GM in a Canadian market, so he understands the pressure cooker that is Canadian hockey. Especially, you know, Toronto's going to be an even bigger pressure cooker than Calgary was. You know, Toronto, Montreal, by far the biggest. You get probably Vancouver next. You get Edmonton, Calgary, Ottawa, Winnipeg, probably all somewhat comparable in that sense as far as that goes from media and fans, etc. But, you know, he knows what that's like. And he's obviously not afraid to make big moves. You can say what you want, and you can say whether or not he did a good job with those deals or he didn't. The fact is he's not afraid to engage in conversations that can be franchise-altering and not respect. But you also got to remember that it's a learning experience. Typically, a lot of people learn and get better at the job as they go. You heard Craig Conroy, after being hired as the GM in Calgary, talking about how things were handled with Gaudreau and Tkachuk and how all that went down, and that how all the things that he learned, the things that he would want to avoid with his tenure as GM now. So, you know, certainly there's a little learn as you go. So I think out of all the candidates that were available, Treliving was certainly one of the best options out there. Of course, you look back to earlier in his tenure, he did swing off other big trades, including the big one that came a number of years ago now at the draft with the Carolina Hurricanes, which sent Dougie Hamilton and at the time Adam Fox, who was still a prospect, who had not signed with Calgary. Of course, Adam Fox forced his way into 2 trades, one with Calgary and one with Carolina. He would have wanted to be a New York Ranger and worked his way there because he was in college playing hockey and would not sign. He refused. He's like, no, trade me. I'm not signing. So Carolina got Dougie Hamilton and Adam Fox and sending Elias Lindholm and Noah Hannafin back to the Calgary Flames. Hannafin and Lindholm have been long-term great fixtures in Calgary. Lindholm, of course, last year was part of the top line in hockey with Gaudreau and Tkachuk. So, and Hannafin's been a steady defender, for the duration of his time there. So certainly, that's another good move. He seems to really like former Canuck players. He brought in, at one point, we were calling the Flames the Calgary Canucks. A lot of former Canuck players ended up there, signed Jacob Markstrom, Chris Hanna, just to give a couple of examples of that. You remember the big trade, a big trade of poor contracts, we'll call it, with the Milan Lucic, James Neal contract swap with Edmonton Oilers. Much as a lot of people viewed that as a lose-lose, I'd say Lucic worked out better in Calgary than Neal did in Edmonton. So, I give him a W on that one, even though really it was, like I said, a swap of bad contracts. His drafting record has been, I'd say it's okay. It's not great. They did have a few later round picks turn out to be pretty good looking prospects. Like, for example, their prize goaltender prospect right now, Dustin Wolf, was a 7th round pick. Although, caution, that's not that uncommon. You look around, goaltenders being really late picks, that's not unusual. So we'll give them some credit, but I don't want to overblow that. They've made good with a lot of their first round picks, but if you look at the first round selections that they made, and you look at some of the players that have come later, it's always easy to look back in hindsight, of course, and say, well, they could have taken that player, whatever. But for the most part, you could say their drafting record, decent for sure. I do wonder, like I said, some of the other situations he was faced with last year, like the Gaudreau and Tkachuk. I wonder how much influence that was on the Daryl Sutter coaching situation and the fact that things were getting toxic and players just were not loving playing for Daryl. I do wonder how much of a role that played in everything as well. I kind of wonder if ownership forced Daryl upon Brad. I don't know if he really wanted to have Sutter there as a coach, and ownership is what overruled him. I don't know how well that worked. But not only is he used to working in a Canadian market, which comes with tons of pressure and tons of scrutiny, obviously he's used to the similar structure that you have in Toronto. Calgary often had a president above him and an ownership. Obviously that's, fairly involved, whereas Toronto has Shanahan and the board of directors at MLSE. So I don't think the structure will be a problem for him at all, which is also good. A lot of, potential candidates might not have wanted to work in that kind of environment. It might have been pushing for the same sort of authority that Dufour was looking for, which played a big role in the contract negotiation breakdowns, which led Shanahan to move on to a new guy at the helm here to be the general manager. So all in all, I'll say this. Brad Treliving, I think, will do a good job in Toronto out of what's available with experience, because Shanahan made it clear he wanted experience. I think he's one of the better choices. Do I think Kyle Dubas would have been the right choice to stay? I kind of do, to be honest, but we'll never know how that will work out because it's obviously not going to happen. Word is right now that Sheldon Keefe is most likely going to remain the head coach, that there's not going to be an immediate change. He only has 1 year left on his contract, so they have to determine, do they let him play that out and do the same sort of scenario they did with Dubas last year and say, well, we'll let you have the last year and reevaluate, or they'll do that mid-season or during the playoffs. I don't know what they're going to do in that regard, because to be honest, the Maple Leafs regular season record, it should be good for an extended period of time. I don't think that's going to be the concern here. The concern is can they get over the hump in the playoffs and go further and further until they can get closer to win a Stanley Cup. That's what they're looking for here. So to me, I think I wouldn't be shocked if he does stay, which is expected right now, that he gets the last year, they see how things go in the playoffs, and they take a similar approach like they did this year with the GM, and either extend him or offer an extension or move on depending on how things go at that point. Now, will Sheldon Keefe want to stay if they don't offer an extension? Hard to say, but I'm sure he's not going to want to not get paid on his contract, because if he resigns and quits, then he's not going to get paid. So I can't see that playing out either. There could be obviously other changes to the staff. We know that Spencer Carberry just left to go take the head coach job in Washington, so there will be at least one addition to the coaching staff, assuming Sheldon Keefe is indeed still the head coach. There could be other changes within the hockey operations department, which we'll have to see what Treliving wants to do. But he's going to have a lot of business to tend to very quickly here, so it's hard to say exactly how things get tackled. No matter what happens, it's fair to say that everything's going to be, highly scrutinized, and certainly going to be interesting to see how everything plays out. Be very interested to hear the press conference, which, like I said, likely it could be tonight, but I'm going to say more likely tomorrow morning when we get to hear from the new GM himself and Brendan Shanahan and see what they have in store for Maple Leaf fans moving forward. Let me know your thoughts on the GM hiring in Toronto. Brad Treliving, are your thoughts? Did they get the right guy? Could they have a better candidate that was available on the open market? Let me know your thoughts, and we'll talk about it further in the comments. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with the latest news, rumors, and analysis of all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.